Plumbing Solutions educational series. In this episode, we're going to talk about the tape measure. Now, a lot of people take the tape measure for granted, but it's probably one of the most important tools in your toolbox, and it's got a lot of history behind it. So you might ask, well, what do we need to stick with numbers on it for? Well, since the dawn of humanity, we had a problem. We needed to know how far something was away, how tall things were, how big, how deep things were, and we needed a way to convey that accurately to our neighbor or the guy in the next village. So we had to come up with something, and at first they were comparing it to things they knew in nature. Oh, it's as big as a rock. How big's a rock? So we fast forward a little bit to the ancient Egyptians about 7,000 years ago, and they were using their body parts. And here's a couple of them. On your index finger, from your first knuckle to your second knuckle, that distance is what they called a digit. To us, it's about an inch. One of the other ones they had was called the span, and that's with your hand spread wide out like that from the tip of your thumb to the tip of your pinky. That's about 9 inches, or 9 digits. The next one that they used a lot was the cubit, and that's from your elbow to the tips of your finger up here. And that's roughly about 18 digits, 18 inches, or 2 spans. It's about 1.5 feet. If you've ever got to make a guesstimate measurement that's kind of accurate, you can do that. Well, this works out great when you're making measurements with everybody being about the same size. But if you take a guy who's 5 foot tall, measure his cubit, and then you take a guy who's 7 foot tall and measure his, they're gonna be different because people are different. So they had to come up with something better. So what they did was they measured the pharaoh's cubit, and they called it the royal cubit, and they made the first measuring sticks, and they distributed these to the people. Now, there's a problem with a wooden measuring stick. These two look about the same, but if you put them together and compare them, one of them is slightly shorter. Now, I cut these, and I did this on purpose. You know, this is fine when you're selling cloth or something like that, but you're not building pyramids like this, because you go a couple thousand cubits with the shorter one, you're going to find that that distance adds up a lot. And it's not going to work out too well when the guy in the quarry has a shorter cubit than the guy on top of the pyramid. Things aren't going to match up. So we go from the royal cubit to Rome, ancient Rome, and they were using what they call barley corns, which is the little seed out of barley. It's about the size of a grain of rice, and they're all pretty much identical. But you're laying little seeds end to end to end to end to come up with a measurement, and that's not real practical. From there, we jump into the Renaissance Britain, and they're measuring the king's foot, and that's where we get our foot from, and it was pretty close to 12 inches, and that's kind of what standardized that. Now, those measurements have changed a lot over the years, being corrected upon up until we get to about 1980, and they came up with the exact distance for a meter, and that was using how fast light could travel in a vacuum. Pretty much the meter is based off of light speed. So that kind of brings us up to date on some of the history of that. Remember those measurements on those body parts, because you might need them one day. So the next thing, I'm going to bring the camera in a little closer, and we're going to talk about some of the finer points of this tape measure. Alright, let's talk about the tape measure itself. This design here is pretty much the most common design you're going to see out there today. It's the self-retracting, self-contained tape measure. There was a patent on this at one time. I think it was back in the 60s, but patents, most of them only last about 20 years, and then it's open for other companies to design their own and do what they want with it. So there are a lot of different brands out there. Pretty much every tool manufacturer is going to manufacture a tape measure, and it's going to be in their colors with their logos and stuff on it. But they're all pretty much the same. They all measure accurately because there's strict standards on measurements. But one of the first things you're going to see is it's in a plastic housing. A lot of times these outsides are rubberized as to help it. If you drop it, it helps give you a better grip on it. The housing is there to protect it from dirt and whatever might try to get inside there. The next thing about these tape measures is pretty much all of them are going to come with a belt clip on the back of it. Now that's so you can clip it onto your belt or on your pocket or on the side of your tool bag or something like that. That way you have it conveniently ready to use. The next thing about these is most of them are going to have some kind of locking apparatus on it. This one is a self-locking one where you have to actually push the button in to retrieve that tape. Some of the older ones or some of the cheaper ones out there, you'd pull it out and then push it down and lock it. It was more of like a switch than a button. The next thing, and one of the important things that a lot of people don't really know, I know I didn't know as a kid, this blade on the front, this hook, it wiggles back and forth, and for a long time as a kid I just thought all my dad's tape measures were wore out, but there's a purpose for this, and that's because there's two ways to hold your tape measure when you're making a measurement. You can hook it like that, or you can bump it. And what that does is it takes into account the width of this blade. If you hook it, it comes out slightly. If you bump it, it moves in. That gives you a better or more accurate measurement. Now, say you rip your hook off or something and you gotta get that last measurement and you don't have a spare tape and this front's broken, there's a trick here you can do. You can, what they call cutting an inch. This also gives you a more accurate measurement if you're trying to be real precise. You can line your inch mark up on your board and read it that way. Now remember, when you do this, you've got to subtract out that inch again, because this is reading 4.5 inches, but the width of this board is actually 3.5 inches. Now there's another method here. If you lose the whole front end of your tape, you can grab any old foot mark and hold that foot mark on there and cut the whole foot. Now this is going to give you a 3.5 measurement on this board, but remember, it's not a foot 3.5 inches, it's 3.5 inches because you're cutting this foot out of there. Now the next thing I guess would be how to read your tape measure. Now this one is marked out for you, and I hope my camera focuses in good here, but it's got your decimals right there marked for you. And pretty much if you look at the top here, that tall line in the middle, that's going to be your half mark. That's the 1/2 inch. And then next to that, there's the next longer line is your quarters, and there's 2 of those. Those are your quarter marks. That's 1/4 and 3/4. And of course, the half would also be 2/4, but you reduce that fraction. Then the next line is going to be your 1/8. And then after that, the smallest line on here is your 1/16. Now, a lot of time in plumbing, we're not going to be as accurate to a 1/16. We might not measure down that far. Of course, you want to measure it as accurately as you can, because you're not ever going to cut it exact. Plus, you've got saw blade widths and stuff like that to take out of there. Now, there's a lot of tape measures out there that are designed for specific jobs that have specific markings on them. Some of them have some scales on the back of them. But a lot of them are what I would kind of call a framing tape measure. So, well, the first thing you're going to notice is when you hit that foot mark, you're going to have like a little arrow. And that's a pretty common symbol for the foot mark. It'd be, 1 F, and of course that big arrow. You're going to have one of those every so often, every foot. The 2-foot mark, the 3-foot mark. It's just those symbols are there to help you along and make it a little bit easier. Now, if you notice, once you get past that 1 foot, you're going to start seeing these red inch marks. Now, what those are is, say, you got 14 inches. Well, you could also convey that as 1 foot 2 inches. It's just another method of how you would read it. Now, why I call this a framing tape measure is because it has these boxes with the arrows, and those are every 16 inches. And the reason that is that's your standard stud bay width. From stud to stud, they call it 16 inches on center. You can also do 24 inches on center, but we don't really see a whole lot of builders doing that. They would do that to cut costs on lumber. But like I said, there is one of these every 16 inches. So the next one's going to be at 32. The next one's going to be at 48. And that's for your studs in your walls. Now, the next mark on here, and this is a fun one for me. Anytime I ask somebody, well, can you read a measuring tape? And they say, oh, yeah. I'll say, well, what's the little triangle for? What's the little, sometimes it's a diamond. Now, these are every 19.2 inches. There's a little mark there. And they do 0.2 because it doesn't quite line up with a fraction mark. It's a little bit off. Now, not something you're really going to use, but this is for engineered truss systems like your LVL, your TGIs, some people call it a paper joist, or your web trussing. Those engineered, not built out of 2x6s or 2x8s or whatever, not site built, but engineered beams. They're going to sit at that 19.2, and then there, of course, there's going to be another triangle at, where is it? There it is, 38.4, and so on. And that's for your engineered truss systems. That's pretty much the gist of it. Tape measure, you're gonna have to work with it. You're gonna have to get used to calling out these measurements, because a lot of times you've got a guy in a ceiling and then there's a guy on the ground actually cutting the material. So you have to learn how to say, 6 1/8, 6 1/4, or 1 foot 3 1/2, or 15 1/2 inches. You'll figure it out and get the feel of it as you go, and this will become pretty commonplace for you.